On 7th of October 2023, the world witnessed the first invasion of Israel since 1948, where up to 5,000 members of Hamas, the Palestinian group in control of the Gaza Strip, crossed the borders and killed 1,139 people and took 250 hostage in Israel. Since then, the world has been gripped by this terrorist attack, which has led to over 44,000 Palestinians now killed in Israel's retaliation, with the war continuing for over 14 months. To make sense of this, we have The Original Sin, a book by Stanly Johny, which ThePrint is launching as a part of its softcover, its platform to release select nonfiction books. The book is published by HarperCollins India. I have with me the author, Mr. Stanly Johny, who has traveled extensively through Israel, the West Bank, and has, sort of come out with this book at this point in time to make sense of the war from an Indian perspective as well. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you, Keshav. Thanks for having me.
So my first question, right, and I think this comes right at the end of your book. It's your conclusion. You call it The Revenge of Old West Asia. And you say that Israel's point is that, a Palestinian state with radicalized Islam is not in its security interest. But you point out that, the radicalization is not because they're Palestinians, but it's because of an absence of a valid peace process that could, give them their own state. Which stems from the 1948 partition plan, and it's a historical problem, but there is no peace plan, and that absence has led to Hamas's 7th October attack. I just wanted to get your sense on that, sir.
So I try to look at the crisis from a historical point of view, because many experts focus on October 7, what happened on October 7, because after that, Israel launched its war on Gaza, and then West Asia is now in turmoil. But when you try to understand this, Hamas is an Islamist militant organization which has used terror, suicide bombings, killed Israeli civilians, etc., etc. And Israel's narrative is that it is because of Hamas. If Israel concedes, if there is a compromise and a Palestinian state is created, that would invariably threaten Israel's security further. This is the dominant narrative. This is the sense you get when you talk to the Israelis. But if you dig a bit deeper, Hamas was formed in 1987 during the First Intifada. And before that, the PLO was the main champion of the Palestinian cause. And the PLO was a designated terrorist organization by the Israelis. But then after First Intifada, what you saw was that the PLO, both the Israelis and the PLO, making compromise and concessions. Because if you look at it from the PLO's point of view, the PLO agreed to accept a future Palestinian state within 22% of historical Palestine. Israel recognized the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. And Israel also committed to the two-state solution when Rabin was the prime minister. So both sides were making compromises, But at that time, Hamas was not even a dominant force. Hamas opposed to the Oslo process, and Iran was not a very influential actor in the Israel-Palestinian conflict at that time. But what we saw was that after the assassination of Rabin, the Oslo process was collapsing. Today, nobody is talking about Oslo. And if you talk to the Israeli politician, there is not a single mainstream Israeli politician who is committed to the two-state solution. Benjamin Netanyahu has said this on record, that there won't be a Palestinian state on my watch. You listen to Naftali Bennett, the former prime minister, he says, no two-state solution. I have been interacting with Israeli journalists, academia, and politicians, diplomats, etc., etc. And some tell me that, two-state solution is there, and the second state is Jordan. Because, a vast majority of Jordan's population are Palestinians, and the rest of the Palestinians can move to Jordan. So you don't see that Oslo, what you saw was that Oslo process was collapsing, and Hamas became a dominant actor in early 2000s. Hamas started using suicide bombings in 2000 to 2005, that period, predominantly. That is also the period which you saw the second Intifada, because Sharon goes to Temple Mount or Haram al-Sharif, whatever you want to call it, that triggers a massive uprising, which was a violent uprising in the second Intifada, after which Israel carries out military crackdowns and then Hamas rises. So my thesis is that it is not Hamas's radicalism or Islamist radicalism that is, killing peace. Rather, it is the absence of peace, if you look at historically, that fueled Hamas or its Islamist militancy in the region. Because there was a possibility to make peace. There was, a two-state solution looked plausible in the early 1990s, but it doesn't look plausible anymore. And now what you have is, on the one side, you have a government headed by Prime Minister Netanyahu, comprising far-right parties, including Itamar Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, etc., etc. And on the other side, you have Hamas. Hamas has not officially recognized the state of Israel. And on the other side, the Likud party, the party's original manifesto says the land between the river and the sea, between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, belongs to the state of Israel. So you have two maximalist positions here.
Right. And I want to break down the history of those maximalist positions, because I know you go through it. You talk about the Hashemite kingdom of Transjordan that made claims on West Bank under Abdullah, and how his brother Faisal first, where it was in Syria and then later in Iraq. So you have this real, multiple messes that stem from the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Right? That is that point. It's the Treaty of Severus, the Sykes-Picot Pact, the Balfour Declaration, and all of that seems to not come into conversation today, where we focus on 7th of October, we focus on the terrorist sort of attack, but the entire spectrum of this history just seems to evaporate the moment we try to go deeper than Israel's security concerns. Why is that? Because I know you put a quote of Golda Meir from 1969 saying that there are no historical Palestinians.
There is no such thing as Palestine.
There is no such thing as Palestine. So it's not something that is a maximalist position that is Netanyahu's position, but it's a legacy of, I think, the Zionist movements of the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, right? So I just want you to dig a little bit deeper there and sort of break down, why does those conversations evaporate the moment we talk about, a solution in West Asia?
So, I think Israel doesn't want to focus on the historical bit, which starts from the late 19th century until 1948. Israel doesn't focus much on that. Israel says it has a spiritual and biblical claim over the land, and there was a kingdom of Israel during BC, 7th century, which is fine. And because Zion, the return to Zion was one of the promises, even if you go back and study about the early Jewry of Europe. And that was one of the remaining promises. And the Holocaust and the persecution of Jews in Europe that actually led to the rise of the Zionist movement and the immigration starting late 19th century. So the first chapter is actually three profiles of Herzl and Weizmann and Ben Gurion. So where I try to track the early stage of Zionism, the Zionist movement. But the problem is that and you have a state of Israel, and state of Israel is a reality, right? And you go to the UN Security Council resolutions, UN General Assembly resolutions. Israel has the legitimacy to exist. Nobody is questioning that. But then if you are basing your argument on the UN Security Council resolution starting 1967, the Palestinians have a right to return. The Palestinians have a claim over their statehood. You had an indigenous population. When the state of Israel was created, which Israel calls their independence, in 1948, 750,000 Palestinians have been displaced. So they have a right to return, which the Israelis are never going to accept, because if they are going to accept that, Israel's demography will change. And Israel is a Zionist country, right? There is a basic law that recognizes the Jewish character of the state of Israel. So you have the problem of the return of the refugees. That is one thing. And then secondly, what should be the border of an Israeli state? Because Israel is perhaps the only country that doesn't have a clearly demarcated border. Because now you see the border is changing again because Israeli troops are there in Syria, in the Golan Heights, grabbing more territories. So the border is, especially with regard to the conflicts with the Arab world, Israel's border continues to evolve. So they don't want to talk about that. The third question is Jerusalem, because even if you go back to the original resolution of the UN partition plan, because Israelis always say that Israel was created based on the partition plan, because partition plan never went to the Security Council, but Israel, the early Zionists declared the state of Israel in 1948, May 14, based on the partition plan. But according to the partition plan, Jerusalem was supposed to be an international city. And there was geographical contiguity between the West Bank and Gaza. But in the first war, 1948-49, Israel would capture some 25% territories more than what the partition plan had actually promised, including West Jerusalem. And West Jerusalem has been Israel's seat of power. East Jerusalem, according to international resolutions, is an occupied territory. But Israel captured East Jerusalem in 1967 and immediately annexed East Jerusalem. But the Arabs living in East Jerusalem are not being treated as equal citizens. So it's a the history here, if especially if you are looking at history starting from late 19th century until 1948 or 1967, it's a very complicated case here. And you have hundreds of thousands of people who have been displaced. You have people who have been denied of their statehood. And you have UN Security Council resolutions that ask Israel to pull back from the West Bank, from Gaza, from Sinai Peninsula, from the Golan Heights. Of these, Israel pulled back only from Sinai Peninsula, which was again part of a bilateral agreement with the Egyptians. So history is here clearly contested. So that's also the reason. And Israel's narrative, if you look at Israel's narrative at this point of time, it is to blame Palestinian radicalism. Israel says it is a security-driven narrative. It is not a history-driven narrative right now.
Right. And this you started out with saying that it's a fact that Israel has a right to exist, and this is India's position. Prime Minister Nehru, you also mention it in your book, says we would have liked to recognize Israel earlier than 1950, but it is fact, and it is a concern. Therefore, we now extend recognition. But for about 42 years, you see India not having diplomatic ties at a level of ambassadors or missions. And then you see a change. And then, from 98 to 2004, again, the ties flourish. And then since 2014, the ties, have hit the heights that, India and Israel have never seen before. And it's a two-way partnership, right? About $10 billion in trade. There's a lot of convergences between India and Israel. What do you think led to this sort of change? Is it because India has also shifted to a security-driven foreign policy? Is it around that? And also then the Modi factor, because I know you have a subchapter in your book on this, but how much has that changed India's position then on West Asia and, the two-state solution within West Asia?
So, yeah, India's position has evolved over the years, as you mentioned, and we can see both change and continuity. And for the change, we can identify many factors. For example, 1991, the world changes. Soviet Union collapses. The United States becomes the world's most powerful country. You have a unipolar world order. And India reorients its foreign policy. India was reaching out to the Americans. India wanted to, build a new equilibrium in its relationship with the world's new masters. And Israel, even when India remained a supporter of steadfastly, India supported the Palestinian cause. India maintained contact with Israel throughout. Even in 1962, Israel was one of the countries India reached out to for weapons during the China War. So this relationship actually dates back. But at the same time, India, being a champion of the third world independence movements, being a country that opposed to the partition of Palestine, historical Palestine, India continued to champion the Palestinian cause, and the PLO, India was one of the early countries that recognized the PLO, and the PLO was also invited to the non-alignment movement. So you have this whole history of supporting the Palestinian cause, and then the world changes. And India then, India wanted to build a stronger, better ties with Israel. And you always have this defense and, technology angle in that relationship, starting from the 1990s. And the bilateral relationship just kicks off in the 1990s between Israel and, India. But at the same time, India maintained its its Palestine policy, in a sense, its support for the two-state solution, specifying that India supports the creation of a Palestinian state based on the 1967 border with East Jerusalem being its capital. This was the stated position. And if you go back to the 1990s, prime ministers from Rao to Gujral to Devagowda to Vajpayee, everybody had said on record that India unequivocally supports the Palestinian cause. And this has been India's position until 2015. I'm saying 2015 because in 2015, when President Pranab Mukherjee visited Ramallah, Jerusalem, and Amman, so he repeated the same position, right? Like India supports the Palestinian state, creation of a Palestinian state based on 1967 border. 1967 border is important because there is a UN Security Council resolution that is asking Israel to pull back from all the territories it captured in 1967. That includes East Jerusalem. And the Palestinians say that East Jerusalem should be the capital of a future Palestinian state, right? But then from 2015 onwards, India's position is that India supports a just solution to the Palestinian question, or India supports a two-state solution. India doesn't refer to the border. India doesn't refer to Jerusalem anymore. I had a conversation with one of the Indian diplomats in 2018, I guess, while we were flying back from Tel Aviv. So he was telling me that India's position hasn't changed much, but then I pointed out this difference, this subtle difference in India's position. So he said, yeah, that is a change, but his point of view was that it is up to the Israelis and the Palestinians to decide what should be the border, or what should be the capital, or what should be the status of the refugees, so and so. It is not up to us. But we have taken a moral position in favor of the Palestinian cause, which hasn't changed. And if you look at India's position post October 7, so see, roughly there were 6 resolutions in the UN General Assembly. In the first resolution, which was promoted by Brazil, immediately after Israel launched its war on Gaza, India abstained from the resolution, right? Which that resolution had called for a ceasefire. And India's position was that it did not condemn the Hamas attack on Israel. So India would not support that resolution. But after that, there were 5 consecutive resolutions. And one called for Israel's withdrawal from Syria's Golan Heights. One specifically condemned Israel's continuing settlements in the West Bank. And one endorsed the Palestinian right to self-determination. And another one called for a ceasefire. And then 2 days ago, as you mentioned, that India supported in favor of another resolution that called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. So yes, India's relationship with Israel has improved, and definitely there is an ideological factor as well after the BJP came to power, because Prime Minister Modi refers to Prime Minister Netanyahu as his close friend, and there is this convergence of Hindutva and Zionism, because you talk to Israeli right-wing experts, they have very close contact with the BJP or its ideological organs here. So that factor is also there. But at the same time, if you look at India's overall West Asia policy, I would say it has 3 pillars. One is the Arab world, one is Iran, and the third is Israel. And it is imperative for India to maintain the balance between the 3 pillars, irrespective of whoever is in power. And what I could see now is that India continues to do that balancing. Yes, of course, India has excellent ties with Israel, but still, and India's Palestinian policy has also evolved. But you could see that India continues to balance between these 3 pillars. For example, if I quote the foreign minister, I think he spoke this at the Munich Security Conference Forum. He said that at the end of the day, the fact of the matter is that the Palestinians are denied of their statehood. And he also said Israel should have been mindful of the civilian casualties in Gaza, which is a very overt criticism of the way the war is being conducted. And if you look at the UN General Assembly voting record, India has again and again voted in favor of the Palestinian cause. So you can see both continuity and changes in India's foreign policy. There are changes in its specific approach, but at the same time, the overall India remains supportive of the Palestinian cause.
Right. And so I come to my final question then, because, you know, West Asia has evolved. We have IMEC, we have the Abraham Accords, we have the peace treaty between Israel and Jordan, the Camp David Accords, right? Saudi Arabia, the custodian of the two holy mosques, looking to, seek peace with Israel, which would then change the very, ties between the Arab world and Israel. But then there is still this, I imagine, issue. Palestine, right? There is still this fundamental issue: is how far can the Arab world go before its own populations become, raise protests on this. So this original sin, this issue of West Asia, where do you see from your understanding and how much you've dealt with the Israeli politicians, the academia, and travels through the region? How much do you see that measure for compromise to solve these issues? How much do you see that actually playing out in, say, the next 2, 3, 4 years, because of what we are watching from Gaza, and how, unlike 67, where you would get magazines weeks later telling you what the Israelis did, this is a real-time war, right? So how do you see that?
See, my central argument of the book is that the Palestine issue is now back in the fore of West Asia's geopolitics, because if you are talking about West Asia in September 2023, Palestine had been pushed to the margins. The Saudis and the Israelis were in a very advanced stage of normalizing ties. Saudi Crown Prince said this in as many words in Delhi when he came for G20. And yes, we had IMAC, and everybody was very hopeful about IMAC taking off. And now IMAC is not going to take off because the Saudis are not going to normalize ties with Israel in the foreseeable future. That is another matter. So, but now, yes, Palestine is back in the forefront. But at the same time, you see, the Israelis are not in a mood to make any compromise. And Netanyahu has made that clear. There was a resolution passed on the Knesset floor that is against the Palestinian state. Israel was, furious when a couple of European countries recognized the Palestinian state. And Israel's point of view is that if they make compromises at this point of time, that would endanger Israel's security further, especially after the October 7 attack, right? And Gaza has, the numbers speak for Gaza. 45,000 people have been killed, more than 100,000 people have been injured, 2.3 million people, almost the entire population of Gaza has been displaced, and Gaza is not livable anymore. I remember having a conversation with one of the Israeli journalists back in April. I was in Jerusalem, telling me that not a single building standing in northern Gaza that is not occupied by the Israeli military. So this is the reality of Gaza now. But at the same time, the Palestinians in Gaza refuse to leave. And Israel is now back in Gaza. In 2005, Israel exited Gaza because Israel found it increasingly difficult to manage Gaza. And Ariel Sharon unilaterally pulled out of Gaza, both the settlers as well as the Israeli troops. Now Israel is back in Gaza. And West Bank, yes, Israel is maintaining its tight grip over West Bank, but West Bank is restive and it will continue to remain restive. The question is that before October 7, what Israel's approach was to continue the occupation without consequences. But now, after October 7, and continue the occupation without consequences means you had the Abraham Accords. Despite the occupation, the Emiratis were very warm to normalize ties with the Israelis. The Saudis were in advanced talks with the Israelis. The Bahrainis normalized ties with the Israelis, right? But that is not the reality, geopolitical reality now, post-October 7. So, but at the same time, Israel's political class has also changed. They don't want to make any compromise. And the United States, whether it is the Biden administration or the Trump administration, are not going to use any kind of material pressure on Israel to make compromise on Palestine. This is not Jimmy Carter anymore. This is not President Eisenhower. That time is gone, because in the past you have seen Eisenhower, Carter, even Reagan putting pressure on the Israelis, making them pull back. That's not happening anymore. So what you have is that Israel is back in Gaza, and Israel is not going to pull back from Gaza, not in the immediate future. And Hamas has evolved from an organized militant force into an insurgency. Israel is still losing soldiers in Gaza, despite wrecking Gaza completely, right? So this insurgency will continue. West Bank will remain restive. So the Palestinian issue will remain in the fore of West Asian politics without any immediate solution. This is what we are going to see in the immediate future.
Right, and that on that note, which doesn't sound like there is a positive way out of this, looking at the maximalism. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. Once again, I must say, The Original Sin, written by Stanly Johny, published by HarperCollins, gives you a great insight into the history and how we have come to the current situation, looking at two very maximalist positions within Israel-Palestine and the larger Arab world in West Asia. So thank you so much for joining ThePrint, sir.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me here.